In today's lesson, we will first start talking about the decade after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and I will explain why this period in Russian history is referred to as the Wild 90s. And then I will briefly discuss the life in Russia at the beginning of the 21st century, and this lesson will conclude the series of kind of like mini lectures in which I was trying to give you a quick overview of the Russian history. So, the 90s was the period of time after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And I want you to think about how dramatic this transformation was historically, because earlier in the course we talked about 1917 as the collapse of a system that had existed for centuries. And now we see something similar again, not even 100 years later. A political system that had shaped life for decades and that many people believed would exist forever suddenly disappeared. And overnight, Russia entered a completely different political reality. And as always, when massive political systems collapse like that, economic and social instability follows. And as I said, the 90s in Russia are often called the Wild 90s, or in Russian, лихие 90-е, because almost everything in society was changing at the same time, and it was a wild ride. Remember, for more than 70 years, people had lived in a system where the government controlled all aspects of the economy and of the social life and of the information. And at the same time, it provided guaranteed employment and a predictable standard of living. Then, almost overnight, the Soviet Union disappeared. So here, in this new reality, state-owned industries were privatized, something completely new to the Russian citizens. And Russia began trying to build a market economy. And for many people, it felt like the rules of life suddenly changed and nobody gave them the new instructions. So some people became incredibly wealthy, while millions of others saw their savings completely disappear as a result of the hyperinflation. Everyday life became much less stable, crime increased dramatically, corruption became widespread because people were trying to make money any way they could once they got a little bit of power, and organized criminal groups were running parts of the economy pretty much. And the government was too weak and too busy to enforce the laws. And many people who lived in the 90s felt that success or even survival depended less on rules and laws and more on personal connections and luck and simply being in the right place at the right time. So for common people, the 90s were often associated with uncertainty. And as the economy declined, wages were frequently paid late. Then unemployment became a reality for many people, while in the Soviet Union it wasn't even a concept. And social safety nets that had existed during the Soviet period were pretty much non-existent in the new reality. So it was very chaotic, and people who survived the 90s considered themselves both very lucky and very strong. At the same time, the 90s also brought freedoms that had been impossible under the Soviet system. People could travel abroad more easily, they could start their own businesses, they could openly criticize the government, and they could also get access to foreign products and media without being called spies or traitors. So when Russians look back at the 90s today, opinions are again often very divided. So some remember a decade of freedom and opportunity, while others remember instability, poverty, and insecurity. And actually, it was, of course, a wild mix. So some things were becoming better. As I said, the country was moving towards a more stable economic system that is based on free market economy. And eventually this mechanism started working. And the country was also moving towards a truly democratic system. Now, it didn't get there completely for various reasons. And I'm not going to explain it in a lot of detail in this short overview. But it's important to mention that when the Constitution was created and ratified in 1993, it again officially put an emphasis on a strong presidential republic as opposed to a strong parliamentary republic. And the second option was discussed and maybe even preferred, according to some sources, by Yeltsin himself, all the way until the 1993, when his disagreements with the parliament showed him that in a parliamentary system, he would not be able to dismiss the parliament, and in a strong presidential one, he totally could. Again, it's a very simplified version of what happened in 1993, but what's important is that the new constitution created a very strong presidency again. It's kind of like a karma for Russia. So, as the 90s continued, economic problems first got worse before they got better, kind of like towards the 2000s, and conflicts emerged in different regions. And some of those conflicts became violent, including the war in Chechnya. And as those crises intensified, Boris Yeltsin's popularity gradually declined. And leading such an enormous historical change in a huge country placed a lot of pressure on him personally as well. And over time, his health declined significantly. And then came another major breaking point, the world economic crisis of 1998. And for many Russians, it was the final collapse of confidence in Boris Yeltsin's leadership, even though it was more of a historical coincidence that the world economic crisis happened during his term, but it was more kind of like the last drop. Now, if we return to our recurring question about ordinary people, was life becoming better or worse for them? And as I said, economically, for many people, life during the 90s was extremely difficult. But politically and socially, the 90s were also the most liberal period in Russian history. Under Boris Yeltsin, Russia experienced freedom of speech, independent media, freedom of religion, freedom to travel, a real multi-party political system, and much greater freedom of political expression than ever before. And today, many of these freedoms may feel normal or expected, but for people who had lived through the Soviet system, these changes were enormous and historically unprecedented. And one of the most dramatic changes involved the media. For the first time in Soviet and Russian history, there was a period of genuinely independent journalism and free media. And this was something entirely new and exciting, because people had spent decades, or actually hundreds of years, living in systems where information was heavily controlled. Now, suddenly, newspapers and television openly criticized political leaders, investigated corruption, and discussed problems publicly. If the government made mistakes, journalists reported on them. If the president made mistakes, journalists also reported on those mistakes too. And actually, for people interested in journalism and media, I would say the 90s in Russia are an extremely fascinating period because independent media was essentially being built almost from scratch. Okay, going back to Boris Yeltsin, the 90s were really free, but extremely difficult for people financially. And that made many people increasingly frustrated and disappointed with the new system and Yeltsin himself. And as his health declined and political pressure increased, he lost both the energy and the popularity that he used to have. Eventually, before the end of his second presidential term, he stepped down. And he did something historically very interesting. On New Year's Eve from 1999 to 2000, Yeltsin publicly announced the person he hoped would become his successor, and the person was his prime minister, Vladimir Putin. Now, officially, Russia, of course, still the democratic elections and the constitutional path to these elections, but Boris Yeltsin's announcement mattered enormously psychologically and politically. And this connects to a much larger historical pattern that we have discussed throughout this course. For centuries, Russian political culture had been shaped by rulers naming or preparing successors. And democratic political culture in Russia was still relatively new and unstable during the 90s, and the country had only experienced the system for a very short period of time, and those years were strongly associated with economic crisis and instability. So people just didn't know how the democratic system truly works. So for many people, the idea of a leader publicly endorsing a successor still felt natural and familiar. And of course, elections took place, but Yeltsin's support gave Vladimir Putin a major political advantage. Putin won the election with significant public support that was absolutely real. And that marked the beginning of a completely new chapter in modern Russian history. Now, under Putin, one of the first things that happened during his time was a gradual movement away from some of the democratic practices and institutions that had developed during the 90s. And this didn't happen overnight, it happened step by step. Certain political mechanisms that had been introduced in the 90s to move Russia toward a more democratic system slowly became more restricted or modified. And the government introduced the idea of what became known as sovereign democracy. The argument was essentially this: yes, Russia is a democracy and will stay a democracy. But Russia is also historically and culturally unique. Therefore, according to this idea, Russia needed its own special version of democracy rather than simply copying Western political systems. Supporters of this concept argued that Western-style liberal democracy that was introduced in the 90s did not necessarily fit Russian historical traditions or political culture and mindset. So independent and oppositional media that blossomed during Yeltsin's time and that were based on Western ideals of the democracy gradually came under increased pressure to conform to the new requirements. More and more, Russia was changing the common democratic terms and concepts to fit within sovereign democracy idea to the point when the same words describing democratic procedures and institutions don't necessarily mean the same as they do in the West. For example, according to the original constitution, the president is limited to 2 terms, and that's basically the norm in most democratic countries. And Vladimir Putin's second term ended in 2008. And actually, many don't know that, but Putin hasn't been the president for all 26 years from 2000 to 2026. That's right now. Because in the 4 years from 2008 until 2012, a different person was the president, Dmitry Medvedev. Now, Medvedev won the election with a pretty large percentage of the votes for somebody who people barely knew. And then Medvedev appointed Putin as his prime minister. And this created a political situation often referred to jokingly as kind of a tandem rule. So people began asking, like, who's actually making the major decisions? Is it really Medvedev, or is Putin still basically the president but behind the scenes? And looking back, we definitely know the answer to this question now. Then in 2012, Medvedev decided not to run for re-election, and Putin returned to presidency again. And he has been president of Russia ever since, all within the democratic procedures, even though the constitution is now the updated constitution, not the original constitution. And at that stage, the political system became significantly more centralized, and the restrictions on opposition and independent media and political competition became much stronger. Russia also got involved in or initiated several military conflicts, including the full-scale war in Ukraine that has been going on since 2022. So, how about the common people during this time? Now, I talked about the changes in politics under Putin, very briefly, I know, but something else very important was happening economically that's important to mention. So if the 90s had been associated with severe economic hardship for many Russians, the 2000s, or as we call them in Russian, the zeros, were the paradise years in comparison. In the 2000s, global oil prices rose dramatically, and since Russia is a major energy exporter, this created a large influx of money into the Russian economy. And all of those reforms of the 90s finally started giving their results. So as a result, living standards improved significantly for many people across the country. And after years of instability and economic crisis and uncertainty, many Russians finally began experiencing greater financial stability and more normal everyday life. And this created an important political trade-off. Now, people were dissatisfied with this increased government control and limits on political freedoms. But for many people, that dissatisfaction did not outweigh the improvements they experienced financially. So for a large part of the society, the situation became something like this. Political freedoms may be shrinking, but everyday life is becoming more stable and economically manageable, and that balance between stability and political control became one of the defining features of modern Russia in the early 21st century. Okay, I will stop here. And as I said before, we reached the end of this very short overview of the Russian history from the early ages to modern time. And I know it's been many videos, but it's still a very short historical overview. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and thank you so much for watching.
If you like it, please click like.